lessons and then really focus in. I'm really excited about this lesson here, our purpose in prayer. Father, today a lot of different things that went on, and Lord, I need your help to remove distractions, to speak through me, to calm my mind, to say the words that you would have me to say. But Lord, I don't even want to say my own words. I want you to just totally speak through me by your Spirit to your people. Lord, would you teach us to pray? Would you help us to sit at your feet, to learn how to be quiet and to hear? And Lord, would you teach us specifically this evening our purpose in prayer? Lord, it's not just to go through rote repetition. It's not just to pray to mark off the fact that we prayed, or even because you ask us to pray. God, would you teach us what it is, what heart attitude we ought to have, what we ought to accomplish in prayer. In your name we ask it. Amen. So for a quick summary of Lesson 1 and Lesson 2, Lesson 1, we discovered that the disciples, though they grew up in a culture that emphasized prayer, they realized very quickly as they followed Christ that Jesus had an edge on prayer, that he understood some things, the way that he prayed. They didn't know, that they didn't execute. And so they asked, Lord, teach us to pray. And as believers, we literally have Jesus Christ give us the blueprints for how to pray, and then he exemplified a life of prayer, and yet we really turn to anyone and everyone except Christ when trying to model our prayer, right? We'll read Dr. So-and-so or book whatever or prayer journal this on how to pray, but have we ever done a deep dive into the life of Christ and allow him to teach us to pray? And so that's what I am trying to do, and as I am allowing Christ to teach me how to pray, trying to share some of those thoughts with you. The first thing we learned is that Jesus modeled continual communication with the Father. Prayer is not something that you do. It is a life and a heart attitude that we live. Prayer is constant communication with our Father in a lot of different aspects throughout the day. Jesus, in his humanity, depended on that relationship with his Father. It was literally his life to communicate with, receive instruction from the Father, and then to execute whatever it is that his Father told him in prayer. Lesson 2, we understood that some of the foundations and the building blocks of a healthy prayer life and understanding how to pray is that love relationship with the Father and eliminating distractions that would keep us from that relationship with the Father. And there's a lot of good things. Our family, our spouses, our jobs, our property, and the things that God has given us. Those are amazing things, and they each have their place in our life. But if those things take us from the number one purpose in our life, which is a relationship with the Father, and they distract us, now a good thing has become a distraction. A good thing has become a bad thing. And so Jesus allowed nothing, including his hunger, throngs of people that wanted to be taught, people that needed to be healed, his own disciples. He allowed none of those things to distract him from going apart and having communication with his Father. So we have to have a love relationship with God. We have to eliminate the distractions that keep us from fellowship. And we have to pray in the Spirit. We have to allow the Spirit to speak to us. We have to empty ourselves of ourselves and be continually filled with the Spirit. He helps to guide us to know what to pray for. And so that's what we learned in Lesson 2 in summary. So Lesson 3, our purpose in prayer. Prayer is not to convince God to help us. It is to get ourselves aligned with what God is about to do. And that is a groundbreaking, prayer-altering, life-altering principle. When I go to God in prayer, it's not to pray enough times or long enough or cry enough to where God says, well, I guess I'll answer his prayer now. He's been praying for an hour, so now I got to answer him. Prayer is not my chance to try to oblige or obligate God to answer my prayer. Prayer is to change my heart so that God can lay his agenda on my heart. Prayer is God's invitation to enter his throne room so he can lay his agenda on our hearts. And we see this principle in action when observing the prayer life of Jesus. So what is my purpose in prayer? Number one, a heart of submission. A heart of submission. We talked about this in Ephesians. We talked about the word submit. And there are very few words that elicit more of a negative response in an instant than the word submit. But in prayer, our number one purpose is submission to the Father. Jesus was seeking after the Father's purpose, after the Father's activities, and after the Father's heart. Jesus sought God not just for information, but for personal instruction. How often am I guilty of going to God looking for lack of a better term, when we're talking about trades in the stock market, going to God looking for insider information. Hey, God, I know that, you haven't told anybody else, but what are you going to do in church next week? Or what are you going to do in this situation? I know you told me to wait, but can you at least give me a little tip? Why do we go to God and want to find out things that we don't need to know or that God hasn't? If God wanted us to know, he would have revealed it to us in any number of ways. He would have just told us outright. He would have brought someone else to tell us. He would have given us a dream. He would have written it across the sky. He could do any of those things. If God wanted us to know, he tells us. And when God does want us to know things, how many of you could give testimony of when you've been wondering something or looking for an answer for something for so long, been praying for an answer, and all of a sudden it's just like, there it is. And you're like, why did I never think of that before? Because God was withholding that information until it was the right time, the right place for you to know that information. So how many times do we go to God in prayer looking for insider information? I wrote this: you are not going to convince God to tell you something he knows you should not know, cannot know, can't handle, can't know now. There is no collusion with the Father. You're not going to go to God and finally bend his ear to tell you something that you don't need to know. It doesn't work that way. Here's a key, and we go back to this verse. We probably will go back to this verse every week, Hebrews 5:7. Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. Now get this. Was God able to keep Jesus off the cross? Yeah. Was that what Jesus was praying for? Yeah. He said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless. So God's able to do something. Jesus is asking for it, but that wasn't the Father's will. And so how important was it for Jesus to submit to the Father's will, not his own will? Here's the key: and was heard in that he feared. If you have the notes, you'll see underneath I have a more expanded literal translation of that last piece, and was heard in that he fears. It reads like this: who was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. And he was heard because of his own reverent submission towards God, his sinlessness and his unfailing determination to do the Father's will. Can that be said about me? Do I have unfailing determination to do the Father's will? Or when it gets hard, or when it gets confusing, or it gets bewildering, I start to pray outside of God's will because I don't want God's will anymore because it doesn't look like what I think it should look like. Jesus was heard because of his submission and his submissive attitude towards the Father. Jesus had fully yielded his life to the Father's will. And that's the key. Priority number one in prayer is that my life is totally submitted to the Father's will. Praying always in the nevertheless. So really the climax of Jesus' submission to the Father was in Gethsemane, right? And he went a little further. Matthew 26:39 says, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. That should be our heart for every prayer, whether it's a prayer list, whether it's your own personal prayer, whether it's a cry in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day, for something quote-unquote significant or insignificant. Nevertheless, not as I will, as thou wilt. This is no doubt the instance that comes to mind when reading the summary of Jesus' life mentioned in Hebrews 5. Think about Jesus in Gethsemane praying. We read verse 7, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying to where he's sweating drops of blood. There's a pretty stressed out situation there for him to physically do this. And we've all heard the accounts of how that actually physically can happen when you're under so much stress and strain that vessels are broken inside your body and you're literally sweating blood. It's almost like mini aneurysms all throughout your body. We're talking about a high level of stress here. And he's praying with that level of intensity. Strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard, and that he feared. Verse 8, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obeyed. Now, Jesus Christ as our earthly example, Jesus Christ as a man submitted to the Father, what was the result of him submitting to the Father's will? One man submitted to the Father's will. Salvation for the world. Imagine, now I understand, Jesus was God, and you submitted to the Father's will. Dying on a cross is not going to save the world, all right? So there's a little asterisk next to that. But think about the eternal implications. Think about the kingdom work that can be done through your life if it is lived totally submitted to the Father's will. What can God do with a man or a woman who is totally submitted to him? And so that's purpose number one in prayer, is total submission to the Father. Jesus knew what was ahead, yet he submitted to his Father's will no matter the cost. You say, well, I don't know what's ahead. Well, Jesus gave us a pretty good idea of what it was going to look like to follow him. There was going to be persecution. It was going to cost. It was going to be not complicated, but difficult. There was going to be denying of self. Jesus didn't try to sugarcoat it with his disciples. He didn't try to make it easy to say, well, he said, nope. You got to put everyone else second. You got to put me first. You got to count the cost. Discipleship costs, but it pays. So what is your heart's attitude in prayer? Do you argue with the Lord when he brings you an assignment? Say, well, I didn't think I was going to be doing this and such. God didn't ask you if you thought you were going to be doing that. He said, are you willing to do it? Do you cringe or rebel when you hear the word submit? Say, God wants me to submit to him. Well, I don't like that. I don't submit to anybody. Have you determined before you pray that the answer will be yes? There's a big one. Say, God, there's some prayers that the more that I understand about prayer and the power of prayer, sometimes I wait until my heart is right before I pray a certain prayer. Here's one. God, make me willing to, easy there. God will make you willing to do whatever you're about to say. So make sure that your heart's in a place where he doesn't have to do something extreme to make you willing. God, whatever it is. So have you determined when God speaks to you in prayer? Say, God, I want to do whatever it is that you have for me. All right, son, I want you to do this. Well, not that. Okay, so you don't want to do whatever it is. So just tell God that. Be honest. Say, God, these are some things that I'm not willing to do for you. Here are some things that I am. Right? I mean, that's ultimately what it is. So have you decided that the answer will be yes? What is our purpose in prayer? Number one, a heart of submission. Number two, receiving the Father's instruction. Let's look at Mark chapter 1. Love this passage. Mark chapter 1, Jesus has an incredible day of ministry in Capernaum. This is the kind of day that every church, every pastor is looking for. This is the kind of day that you at the end of your life, write in your book of, well, I remember a day, this is one of those days where you look back on. Okay? Mark 1:32, and at even, When the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased. Now, if you were to read in the previous verses, you would see healings, you would see teaching, you would see preaching. There was just an incredible work, a revival going on, in Capernaum. So here's just a snippet of the end of the day. So at the evening, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils, and all the city was gathered together at the door. So there's a large crowd, and everyone that has any kind of demon or devil is there. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. So no doubt Jesus, he gets to bed late because he's been ministering all day, and he didn't start casting out demons and healing these sick until it was already the evening. So he's kept a long itinerary here. He's exhausted from teaching and preaching and healing and casting out demons. Spiritual warfare is very taxing. So he only sleeps for a few hours, because the next morning we find him awake well before daylight, verse 35. And in the morning, rising up a great while before day. This would have been the time when you're like, you know what, I'm just gonna turn the alarm off. I'm just gonna wake up when I wake up, because I am gassed from that day. But he wakes up well before the sun comes up. He went out and departed into a solitary place, and there prayed. We don't know what Jesus prayed for, but what happens next is very instructive. Verse 36. Simon, so here's Peter. It's great, it's always Peter. It's always Peter in a teaching opportunity, right? And they that were with him followed after him. And when they found him, they said unto him, all men seek for thee. Peter said, Jesus, we've been looking for you. Everyone's looking for you. Where are you? What have you been doing? Of course they were looking for him, right? He had just taught them in a way that they had never been taught before. He had just healed people of incurable diseases. He had cast out demons. And so they're looking for Jesus. The disciples likely assumed, when you assume what God's going to do next, you're almost always going to be wrong, right? God's ways are, and sometimes it seems like if you have figured it out, he'll change it up just to keep you in the dark, right? God works in mysterious ways. You're never going to figure God out. When you think you're one step ahead, he's 50 steps ahead. So they might have assumed, hey, we're going to be here for a while. There's a great work going on. But notice Jesus' response. Verse 38, he said unto them, let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also. And then here he gives really a big picture answer. For therefore came I forth. This is the reason that I came, was to go to the next town. His disciples had to have been so confused. How did Jesus know it was time to move on? How did he know that it was, quote unquote, God's will for him not to minister somewhere any longer where his disciples wanted to minister and where people wanted to be ministered unto? The answer is simple yet profound. He got a word from his Father. God had a greater work and a bigger picture plan in mind than the external needs of the people in Capernaum. Now think about this. Jesus was a real person. The disciples were real people. The people in Capernaum were real people. No doubt can you picture the cries of the people as Jesus is leaving? Can you picture them grabbing him and trying to keep him there? Can you picture the disciples in total bewilderment, likely even moved or emotional that, why are we moving on? Picture this, Jesus in his own flesh may have wanted to stay there, right? His heart was always moved for compassion for the people. He was empathetic towards these people that were hurting and healing. But he, regardless of how he felt or his disciples felt or the people that he was ministering felt, he could not go against his Father's will. And his Father said, next town. When we hear from God in prayer, it gives us confidence to remain faithful to God's agenda when others try to interrupt us with their own agendas. I'm beginning to understand this more and more as a believer and as a pastor. I have unlimited opportunities to minister to people. There are more people and more broken situations than I have hours in the day. I will never be able to get to everyone. And so how do I determine to whom and where to minister and what to do? Do I study now? Do I pray now? Do I help this person now? Do I go here? Do I encourage this hurting sheep and bind up their wounds? Do I go to this biting sheep and tell them, hey, knock it off. Quit biting the other sheep. Quit biting the shepherd. We're trying to help you. Do I go find a wandering sheep who's been gone? Do I spend time with a faithful sheep that's been helping me lead? What do I do? I have to get instruction from my Father at the beginning of the day. And then when he gives me a word, be confident that it doesn't matter who else understands what I'm doing. If the Father has given me instruction, I'm a fool to change what he's asked me to do because someone else said, oh, well, can you help me over here? Can you help me do this? And so what is our purpose in prayer? To be submitted to the Father's will, and then to receive our instructions for the day. Number 3, extended prayer. So now we're getting a little more big picture here. Several times, Jesus spent an extended time in prayer, ranging anywhere from all night to 40 days, right? Before a significant decision or an assignment or a season of temptation. One such time was before choosing his disciples. Turn, if you would, to Luke 6. Luke 6. No one would argue that the disciple selection process was important to Jesus' earthly ministry, right? These were going to be his interns for the next 3.5 years, and these were going to be the guys who carried on the message and the work after he was gone and glorified back into heaven. And so Jesus didn't get to pick who he wanted. Jesus, again, had to get a word from the Lord and know who God wanted him to lead. We're going to look at this more I just finished today lesson, I want to say it's lesson 6. Either lesson 6 or 7 in experiencing prayer with Jesus. And it's talking about praying for others. And taking a little bit more of a dive and looking at John chapter 17, where Jesus is reviewing the process of how he received his disciples. These weren't guys that he selected. These were guys that the Father selected for him. And so Jesus knows that his earthly ministry is beginning. He knows it's time for the disciple selection. And so God knew the men that Jesus was to call. John 17:6 says this. And we'll dig into this a lot more in a couple weeks. Here's Jesus praying to the Father. I have manifested thy name unto the men which thou gavest to me out of the world. Notice this. Thine were they. They were yours. They were yours, and thou gavest them me. And they have kept thy word. These were not Jesus' disciples. Ultimately, they were God's disciples. This is so key, not to steal my own thunder for a few weeks, but this is so key. Because as we pray for others, especially those that we're leading, our children, those that are maybe spiritual understudies, our neighbor, no one, including our own children, are ours. They are all the Father's. And so we have to practice this submission to the Father's will and praying the Father's will over those that we're leading, because ultimately they are not ours. Jesus said, thine are they. And so we have to understand that principle. So here it is. How did Jesus know that these were the men that God led him to choose? Here's Luke 6:12. It came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain to pray and continued all night to pray to God. So he's on the front end of a big decision, and he spends all night in prayer. Probably couldn't have spent his time any better on the front end of his decision than praying all night. Notice what happens immediately the next morning. And when it was day, verse 13, he called unto him his disciples. And of them he chose 12, whose also he named apostles. So Jesus prays all night, gets a word from God, chooses his 12 disciples. It was that simple. Why? Because he was prayed up, and he could with confidence said, you, follow me. You, follow me. He skipped over some people. Well, how come he didn't choose the guys in the next boat? Those weren't the guys that God had for him to follow. Follow me. And they arose and followed him. Imagine that. How do we get people to follow and to do the things that God has asked us to ask them to do? By choosing the right people. How do we know who the right people to do the right jobs? Prayer. And finally, beginning to understand some of these principles, the selection of Jack for, the next pastor here. Very simple. I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Jack was the next guy. Why? Because I had spent a lot of time praying, saying, God, this is a big decision, and you got to make it. Because ultimately, this isn't my church. These aren't my people. And God made it abundantly clear. Were there other men that would have fit the bill just fine from a human perspective? Absolutely. But from God's perspective, there was one guy. And that's who I had to go with, regardless if it made sense to me or not. And we have to understand this. And it's not just talking about disciple selection. Anything in our lives. Say, God, sell my house or keep it. Sell my car or keep it. Take this job or look for something different. Prayer. God desires to instruct us just as clearly and just as directly. Don't you want to have that confidence when you go in to make a decision where you know what it is that you're supposed to do? Or maybe you don't know, but you know that God has given you the confidence to say, go, and I will give you the word when it's time. Where you can just walk by the shore and say, follow me. I want that kind of confidence in decision making. It comes through prayer. Are you willing to spend time in prayer on the front end of every assignment? When was the last time you spent an extended time in prayer to receive wisdom from God? If you had to think about it for a minute, it's been too long. Extended time in prayer. And that doesn't have to be all night. It doesn't have to be 40 days. Hey, can I take my vacation? What are you doing? I'm going to take 40 days in prayer. You might get fired. But a season of prayer, a season of fasting for decision making. Lastly, what is our purpose in prayer? To be submitted to the Father, to receive the Father's instructions, to spend extended time in prayer before decisions, and ultimately, that God's kingdom and God's will would be done in and through me. Jesus told his disciples to pray, your kingdom come, meaning God's kingdom come. Not my kingdom. We have way too many people, and I am guilty of this as much as the next, praying my kingdom come, my will be done. It's thy kingdom. Jesus' great desire was that God would have sovereign rule in his life and the lives that believed on him. Does God have unhindered access in your life for his kingdom? Or is there something that you won't do? Is there somewhere that you won't go? Is there something that you won't give? Or is there someone that you're not willing to go with or without? See, I'll do that, but not with him, not with her. Or, well, but I would never leave so-and-so. Jesus said if he's not willing to hate father, mother, children, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. There has to be nothing and no one that comes before Christ. Allow Jesus to be the example of purpose and submission in prayer. Here it is. Prayer is God's invitation to lay his agenda on your heart. That sounds so good. It's such a crisp little phrase to say, oh yeah, I want God to lay his agenda on my heart. And then he does, and you say, I don't like it. It doesn't sound like, well, I like what he's doing in so-and-so's life. I like what he's doing in pastor's life, but how come what God gives me to do doesn't seem as fun? Or do you know that there's a lot of things about what God asks us to do that aren't necessarily fun? Do you know that the sole purpose of life is not fun or even happiness? It's to do God's will. There are a lot of things about Jesus' life that were unsavory and unfun. Jesus didn't have a bed to sleep on. He didn't have honor in his own country. He spent a lot of hungry, tired, thirsty, misunderstood evenings and days and weeks and months. And then he was brutally murdered at the hands of the people that he came to save. He was rejected of men. Say, I want to do God's will. Jesus did. It wasn't always a bed of roses. And so I'm not trying to paint a dark picture for you, because I have experienced that doing God's will, though there are times where it's difficult, it ain't any harder than doing your own will or doing Satan's will for your life. And so we have to come to the place in prayer where I'm willing to say, God, I'm totally submitted to you. I want to receive daily, weekly, monthly instructions from you, and usually he doesn't give it instructions much further out than that. Father, not my will, but thine be done. Use me for your kingdom. That is our purpose in prayer.